Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we are continuing our reading of Village Affairs by Miss Reed. It came as no surprise to the good people of Fairacre when they heard that a week or two after the visit of the police to the Coggs house, Arthur Coggs was to appear in court, charged, together with others, with stealing a quantity of lead roofing, the property of H.A. Maughan, Esquire. At the time of the theft, the Caxley Chronicle had given some prominence to the affair, enlarging upon Mr. Maughan's distinction as an ornithologist, and reminding its readers that the gentleman had frequently contributed nature notes to the paper's columns. News must have been thin that week, for not only was Mr. Maughan given an excessive amount of type, but a photograph was also included, taken by one of the younger staff against the background of the depleted summer house. Even the kindest readers were at a loss to find something nice to say about the likeness, and the subject himself said it looked to him like an explosion in a pickle factory, adding tolerantly that maybe he really looked like that and had never realized. "There's 3 other chaps," Mr. Willett told me. "2 of 'em is Bryant's, that gypsy lot, and the third's a real bad 'un from Bent. I bet he was the ringleader, and that poor fool of an Arthur Coggs told him about the roof here. I still reckons we ought to keep watch on the church, but the vicar says we must trust our brothers." "He's a good man," I commented. "A sight too good, if you ask me. There's brothers and brothers, I told him. I wouldn't want any of them for brothers, and I wouldn't trust 'em no farther than that coke pile, idle thieving lot." "We don't know they're guilty yet," I pointed out. "I do," said Mr. Willett, picking up his screwdriver. I overheard a conversation in the playground as I strolled round holding my mug of tea. It was a glorious May morning. The rooks cawed from the elm trees as they went back and forth feeding their hungry nestlings, and the children were sitting on the playground bench or had propped themselves against the school wall, legs outstretched, as they enjoyed the sunshine. Joseph Coggs sat between Ernest and Patrick, all 3 oblivious to the condition of their trouser seats in the dust. "Saw your dad in the paper," said Ernest. "Ah," grunted Joseph. "Been pinchin', ain't he?" said Patrick. "Dunno. That's what the paper said." Joseph scratched a bite on his leg and said nothing. "That's what the copper come about," said Ernest to Patrick. "Is he in prison?" asked Patrick conversationally of Joseph. "No!" shouted Joseph, scrambling to his feet. His face was red and he looked tearful. He rushed away toward the boys' lavatories, obviously craving privacy, and I approached his questioners. They gazed up at me innocently. "You should stand up when ladies speak to you," I told them, not for the first time. They rose languidly. "And don't let me hear you upsetting Joseph with questions about his father. It's none of your business, and it's unkind anyway." "Yes, miss," they replied, trying to look suitably chastened. 1 or 2 of the other children hovered nearby, listening to my brief homily, and I was conscious of meaning glances being exchanged. It was difficult to be critical. After all, the Coggs affair was the main subject of spicy conjecture in their homes at the moment, and it was hardly surprising that they shared their parents' interest. That afternoon, when the sun was high in the heaven and the downs were veiled in a blue haze of heat, I decided that a nature walk was far more beneficial to my pupils than a handwork lesson. As the sun was so hot, we kept to the lanes in and around the village which are shaded by fine old trees. The hawthorn hedges were sprouting young scarlet shoots, and in the cottage gardens the columbines were out. The children call them Granny's bonnets, and they are exactly like the beautifully gophered and crimped sunbonnets that one sees in old photographs. Some of the lilac flowers were beginning to turn rusty, and the old-fashioned crimson peonies were beginning to droop their petals in the heat, but the scent was heavy, redolent of summer and a whiff of the long days ahead. The children straggled along in a happy, untidy crocodile, chattering like starlings and waving greetings to friends and relations as they passed. Fairacre, I told myself, was the perfect place to live and work, and early summer found it at its most beautiful. I stopped to smell a rose nodding over a cottage gate and became conscious of voices in the garden. Two neighbors were chatting over their boundary hedge. "And if it isn't Arthur Cox, then who is it?" asked one. I sighed and let the rose free from my restraining hand. Every Eden seems to have its serpent, Fairacre included. Chapter 4. Mrs. Pringle Has Problems. With the departure of the infants teacher, Pat Smith, we were back in the familiar circumstances of looking for a second member of staff. As it happened, only 2 new children arrived for the summer term, both 5-year-olds, making the infants class 17 in all. Altogether, we now had 30 children on roll, and although this might sound a laughably small number to teach compared with some of the gigantic classes in overcrowded urban primary schools, yet there were considerable difficulties. I struggled alone for 2 weeks before a supply teacher could be found. It meant a proliferation of groups working in one classroom, and an impossible situation when one tried to play games or choose a story or a song which would be enjoyed by 5-year-olds and 11-year-olds at the same time. I always feared that some accident might happen when the sole responsibility rested on me to get help and to look after the rest of the school at the same time. It was a worrying time, and I was mightily relieved when Mrs. Ansell arrived to share the burden. She was a cheerful young woman in her 30s, whom I had met once or twice at teachers' meetings in Caxley. She had a young son of 2 and had not taught since his birth, but her mother lived nearby in Caxley and was willing to mind the child if Mrs. Ansell wanted to do occasional supply teaching. All went well for a fortnight, and the children were settling down nicely under their new regime when the blow fell. She rang me one evening to say that her mother had fallen down in the garden and damaged her hip. She was in Caxley Hospital and, of course, quite unable to look after Richard. I expressed my sympathy, told her we could manage, and hung up. Now what, I wondered. Supply teachers are as rare and as precious as rubies. Most of those local few who were in existence lived in Caxley and preferred to attend the town schools. I had been lucky enough to get Mrs. Ansell because she particularly wanted to teach infants, liked country schools, and had her own car. "I shall have to ring that office again in the morning," I told Tibby gloomily, "and what hope there?" Tibby mewed loudly, but not with sympathy. Plain hunger was the cause, and I obediently dug out some pussy love and put it on the kitchen floor. I then supplied my own supper plate with bread and cheese. It was while I was eating this spare repast that I thought of Amy. She had helped us out on occasions, and there is no one I would sooner have as my companion at Fairacre School. "Are you in the middle of your dinner?" was Amy's first remark. "It's only the last crumb of bread and cheese," I assured her. "Is that all you had?" "Yes, why?" "I really do think you should be a little less slapdash with your meals," said Amy severely. "And on your lap, I suppose. It's ruination to the digestion, you know, these scrambled snacks." "Well, never mind that," I said impatiently, and went on to tell her of our troubles. "Could you?" I finished. "I could come on Monday," said Amy. "Not before, I'm afraid, as I'm helping Lady Williams with the bazaar for the Save the Children Fund on Friday." "Come and save my children instead." "And it can't be for long," went on Amy, "as I have Vanessa coming sometime next month." "But you could come for a week or 2? "Probably 3 weeks. James is off to Persia on some trade mission or other, and then to Australia, I believe, unless it was New Zealand. They're so close one gets confused. I believe they're thousands of miles apart, and they get pretty stroppy at being muddled up. It's like the Scandinavian countries, isn't it? Do you know which is top and bottom of that craggy-looking piece of the coastline? No, I don't, but I remember it was always a great help to trace the outline on the way home in the train. The movement was invaluable round the fjords." "You are a darling to come," I said, reverting to the main topic. "I'll ring the office in the morning and get things straight and let you know the result. It really is murder trying to cope alone. One grazed knee or a pair of wet knickers is enough to stop us all in our tracks." "Never fear," cried Amy. "Help is on its way." "The relief of Mafeking," I told her, "will be nothing to it." Jubilantly, I hung up. The office gave its blessings to my arrangements, and we all awaited Amy's comings with varying degrees of pleasure. My own feeling was of unadulterated relief. The vicar, who has a soft spot for Amy, said it would be delightful to see her again, and how very generous she was with her time when one considered that she had a husband and a house to look after. Mr. Willett was equally enthusiastic. "I could ask her about those pinks cuttings I give her," he said. "Always a bit tricky, pinks are, if the soil's not to their liking. I'd dearly love to go over to Bent to keep an eye on 'em, but I don't want to push myself forward." I said I felt sure that Amy would welcome his advice, and he retired to the playground humming cheerfully. Mrs. Pringle greeted the news with modified rapture. Amy is too well dressed, drives too large a car, and altogether has an aura of elegant affluence which Mrs. Pringle disapproves of in a teacher. I think she feels that anyone as comfortably placed as Amy should do a little voluntary work for some deserving charity, but to take on a teaching job smacks too much of depriving some poor wretch of her rightful dues. Since taking to her slimming diet, Mrs. Pringle seems to be even more martyr-like than usual. She received the news of Amy's arrival on Monday with a resigned sigh. "Best get both gates wide open," she said, "for that great car of hers. I take it you'll tell the children to keep off of it? It's a big responsibility having an expensive motor like that on the premises, and I haven't got eyes in the back of my head." I assured her on the point. "The last time she come, she didn't eat no potatoes, I noticed. Now that's a bad example to the children. We tells them to eat up all they got, and then they sees the teachers picking and choosing. Just drop a word, Miss Reed. She's your friend, after all." "How's the dieting?" I asked, hoping to change the subject. Mrs. Pringle's gloom deepened. "That Dr. Martin's getting past it. Fairly snapped my head off when I went to get weighed, 'cause I've only lost 2 pounds in a month. I told him straight, well, at least I've lost it. It's no call to go so white and spiteful. Anyone would think I'd put on 2 pounds. He calmed down a bit then and made me write down all I'd eaten since Sunday. Could you remember it? Most of it. And when I give him the list, he shouted out so loud that Mrs. Pratt's baby started hollering in the waiting room. Why? What was wrong? Well, you may ask. He shouted, I said no cakes, no bread, no potatoes, and no sugar. And I said to him, how's a body to drink tea without sugar? And what's tea time without a slice of cake? And what's a dinner plate look like without a nice little pile of potatoes? He never answered, just went a bit pink and hustled me out, telling me to do what he'd said. No sense in him these days. Too old for the job, if you ask me. But he's right, you know. You won't lose weight unless you cut out all those lovely fattening things. I don't call them fattening, said Mrs. Pringle with immense dignity. They're sustaining. The days I've given up my bread and that, I felt proper lear. My knees have been all of a tremble. With this job to do, let alone my own home, I needs the food. There seemed little to add. Mrs. Pringle shuffled off, limping slightly, a sure sign that her bad leg was giving her trouble, as it always does in times of stress. As she went, I noticed she did up a button on her cardigan, which had burst from its buttonhole under excessive strain. The 2 pounds had not been lost from that portion of her anatomy, obviously. Come to think of it, I pondered, watching her massive rear vanish into the lobby, it would be difficult to say just where she had lost those pounds. The hot weather continued, showing May in all her glory. In my garden, the pinks began to break, shaking their shaggy locks from the tight gray cap which held them. On the front of the schoolhouse, the ancient Gloire de Gien rose, planted by one of my predecessors, turned its fragrant, flat-faced flowers to the sunshine in all its cream and pink splendor. The hay crop looked as though it would be heavy this year, and the bees were working hard. A field of yellow rape made a blaze of color across one of Mr. Roberts' stretches of land, and it was this, I suspect, that attracted so many bees to the area. The copper beech was now in full leaf, and the box edging to the garden beds gave off its peculiar aromatic smell as the noonday sun drew out all the delicious scents of summer. The schoolroom door was propped open with a large knobby flint turned up by the plow in the neighboring field. The sounds and scents wafted in, distracting the children from their work, so that I often took them all into the grass under the trees and let them listen, or not, to a story. The daddy-long-legs floated round us in the warm air, small birds chattered and squeaked in the branches above, and only the sound of Mr. Roberts' tractor in the distance gave any hint of the village life which was going on around us. They were lovely sessions, refreshing to body and mind, and we always returned to the classroom in a tranquil state of mind. Amy arrived on Monday morning, wearing a beautiful pale pink linen suit, but with her usual foresight had brought with her a deep rose-pink overall to ward off such infant-room hazards as sticky fingers, spilt milk, and chalk dust. Some of the children knew her already, and it was not long before her calm efficiency had made friends of them all. I closed the infants' room door with a sigh of relief and set out to catch up with the many neglected lessons of my older children. Things went swimmingly all the week until Friday morning. "Guess who I saw at the bus stop in Caxley?" said Amy, trying to adjust her hair by the reflection from the light of the world behind my chair. "Haven't a clue," I replied. "Why don't you have a mirror somewhere? I see there isn't one in the lobby either. Where do you do your hair?" "At home." "But surely where you've been in the playground on a windy day, you, and the children for that matter, need to tidy up." "We manage." "By just leaving things, I suppose," said Amy. "It's too bad of you, you know. The children could be set an example of neatness. And did you know that the hem is coming down on that frock?" I had a suspicion. There was an ominous tearing sound when I caught my heel in it this morning, but no time to investigate. "Dreadful," murmured Amy, more in sorrow than in anger. "She does try so hard to improve me, with practically no success." "You were telling me," I said, "about someone at the bus stop? Miss Clare?" "At 8:30 in the morning. Don't be silly." "Who then?" "Mrs. Fowler and Minnie Pringle's husband, whatever he's called." "What, waiting for the bus to Springborn?" It looked remarkably like it. I pondered upon this snippet of news. "Do you think they might be going to collect his children from Minnie's?" "It would be a jolly good thing if they did," said Amy forthrightly, "but I doubt it. They've managed quite happily without them, as far as one can see, so why suddenly want a family reunion now?" "It certainly seems odd," I agreed. "Perhaps Mrs. Pringle will be able to throw light on the matter." Sure enough, when Mrs. Pringle arrived for her afternoon duties, it was quite apparent, from the important wobbling of her chins, that she had great news to impart. "Well, I've got that Minnie of mine back again. I've left her grizzling in the kitchen, and the children are in the garden. I've dared 'em to put a foot on the flower beds unless they want to be skinned alive. I can't say fairer than that to 'em." "What's the matter this time?" I asked. Amy, who had picked up her handbag ready to depart, put it down again and perched on the front desk to observe the scene. Mrs. Pringle looked at her with some dislike, but aquiver as she was with her momentous news, she decided to ignore her presence and tell all. "That man had the cheek to come out to Minnie's this morning with that woman who's no better than she should be, and I'll not soil my lips by repeating her name, and ask for his furniture back." "But can he? Isn't it the marital home, or whatever they call it in court?" "Whether he can or he can't," boomed Mrs. Pringle, "he's done it. And that Mrs. Fowler," whose names you wouldn't soil your lips with, I remembered silently, "well, she was at the bottom of it. It was that cat as put him up to it, and her nephew had his van waiting by Minnie's gate to put the stuff in. All planned and plotted, you see. And off they drove, leaving our Minnie without a frying pan in the house." "Nothing at all?" I said, horrified. Mrs. Pringle tutted with impatience. No, they never took the lot, I'll give 'em that, but they took 2 armchairs and a kitchen table and no end of china, and the upstairs curtains and some cooking pots and the frying pan, so of course Minnie and the kids have had no dinner." I could not quite see why the frying pan was the only utensil needed to cook the family's food, but this was no time to go into all that, and I began to feel very sorry for poor luckless Minnie, and for Mrs. Pringle, too, when her next remark cooled my sympathy. "So it looks to me, Miss Reed, as Minnie will be very glad to take up your offer of some work. She's got all that stuff to buy anew, and money's very tight anyway. I told her to come up and see you to arrange things sometime." "Thank you," I said faintly. "Oh, good. Minnie. We'll find out more about the situation next time."